Hello, everyone. My name is Martin Daly. I'm the Director of Water Quality Programs for CDRPC. Welcome to today's webinar, Electric Vehicles and Off-Grid and Movable EV Charging Solutions. For those of you that don't know us, CDRPC is a regional planning resource center that serves Albany, Rensselaer, Saratoga, and Schenectady counties. We foster intergovernmental cooperation, communicating, collaborating, and facilitating regional initiatives. We established this webinar series to help planners sharpen their skills and as a vehicle for planning and zoning board members to obtain credit hours. Now, Planning Board and Zoning Board of Appeals members are required by state statute to obtain 4 hours of training a year, and municipalities have a wide latitude in defining what training is acceptable for credit. After each webinar in the series, each attendee that registered with an email address will receive an email in lieu of a certificate confirming their attendance in the webinar. And this email may be submitted to your municipality for consideration of credit. For practicing AICP planners, we have submitted this session for 1 hour of CM credit to the APA. A few housekeeping notes. Our attendees join with video and audio off for security purposes, but this does not mean that we do not want you to participate. Please do. The method by which we encourage you to participate is using the ask question or the chat function, which you can see at the bottom of your screen where your Zoom controls are located. So please utilize those controls to provide feedback, ask questions throughout the presentation. I'll sort of function like a radio DJ taking your calls and referring them to our guest speakers today. Our presentations will be archived as PDFs, and they'll be available on the same website you used to register for this webinar. That's the Eventbrite website. We are also recording these sessions, and they will be posted to YouTube, and a link to these sessions will also be featured on that Eventbrite website. So don't feel obligated to scribble things down. If you miss something, don't panic. You'll be able to access these materials later. A link to that website will be in the email you receive automatically after this session. Again, today's webinar topic is electric vehicles and off-grid and movable EV charging solutions. We have two parts to this presentation. In the first portion of our program, Promoting Electric Vehicle Charging Station Installations, we'll explain the basics of EV technology, review the current state of EVs in New York, and present step-by-step advice and best practices for facilitating charging stations in the planning process. And then in the second portion of our program, we'll focus on Beam Global's EV ARC units. They're rather unique. Our presenter will share how off-grid electric vehicle applications may provide flexibility options for both fleets and private sectors. Because the mobile applications can be off-grid, they may not need planning, permitting, or the public review process, greatly increasing the speed of installation and lowering barriers to implementing, that's a new word, to implementation. They can also be low-cost test beds for EV applications. So if your municipality is working to supplement their comprehensive plan or their zoning code regulations with encouraging the adoption of EV infrastructure, they may provide a potential solution where a connection to the grid or siting of EV infrastructure may not be possible. So with that, we have two presenters available on our session today. Our first is Victoria, I hope I'm getting her name right, McGarrell of Energetics, and Andy Ike, he's the sales manager of Beam, and I see they're turning on their cameras. I want to welcome them both to the program. I'm going to turn it over to Victoria, who's first going to walk us through underpinning the expansion of EV technology and adoption of EV technology in New York State and some national examples perhaps too, but able to relay the foundation of this emerging technology and how communities are grappling with its progress and installation. So Victoria, thank you very much and welcome to our webinar series.
Great, thank you. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so you should all see my presentation now?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Martin. I appreciate the introduction. So what I just want to say first off is that I'm actually presenting from a resource that Energetics, the company I work for, created with project partners WXY. They're an urban architecture design firm in Manhattan, and it was supported by NYSERDA. So if you are feeling like some of these slides are a little text heavy, it's because this is actually also serves as a static resource for people to click through. It's available for free on our website. And I will follow up with Martin afterwards to make sure you guys have a link to that if you're interested. So this table of contents is from that full resource. We won't cover all of this today because it's just way too much, but just so you're aware, there is a good amount of information available to you. So, oh, sorry if you can hear that. So first we'll go over just sort of the electric vehicle technology that we have. So when we're talking about EVs, we're talking about anything that plugs in, so the plug-in hybrids or the battery electric. I always like to highlight here that OEMs, the manufacturers, they're really continuing to expand what vehicles are available for purchase, and they seem to get better every year. Hybrid drivers versus all-electric drivers behave a little bit differently just because of how much electric miles each can provide. So a hybrid driver might just be plugging in to extend their daily e-miles, whereas a all-electric vehicle might not fully depend on those public chargers for day-to-day driving, but it will certainly help if they're doing longer distance or if they're just looking for a free place to charge, because who wouldn't like a free gas pump, so to speak. So electric vehicles in New York State continue to expand. Registration continues to grow. Pretty self-explanatory here, and no real surprises. The concentration of vehicles and charging stations will be found in those metro areas across the state. But as you can see from this map, there really is opportunity, especially along corridors, to provide more public charging. So, you know, for anyone who might be calling in from somewhere that might not be one of these metro areas, just keep in mind that you know, connecting these areas is going to be really important as registration continues to expand. Next, we have here the level of charges. So again, I'll briefly kind of cover these. There's three main level of charges. There's AC level 1, AC level 2, and then the DC fast chargers. So AC level 1 we consider a trickle charge. It's really for people who are parked for more than 6 hours. Because it is kind of a slow charge. Mostly you'll find these at residential areas, or maybe like they could work for a workplace if you're parked there all day, but still it's not going to give you too much juice. AC level 2 is what you'll see normally in the public arena, and those are the typical stations you see around town. They're better for places that will have vehicles parked for 2 to 6 hours because of that level of charge. And then the next level up is the DC fast chargers. The technology is a little bit different from the AC level 1 and 2. DC fast chargers can provide a full charge in 30 minutes or less usually. They also require a lot more power, which is why you won't see them as often. You know, they're not really a in around town kind of context. You'll see them along highways, for fleets or public metro areas. So we'll get into the planning board and planner actions that you can take. Again, I won't hit all of those subtopics today, but just be aware that that is available for you following this presentation. So first I'll start with some site considerations. We like to highlight that you want to look for these development types or clusters. Charging stations should be where the people are, and especially where the people park. So those EV cluster types, whether it's a downtown area, retail, medical campuses, higher education, this is where you often find charging stations, and where they get a high amount of use, because the people who go there, they drive electric vehicles and they park there for a while. Again, you're looking for places where there's a longer dwell time, there's available electricity. We'll kind of get into more of that in a future slide. Easily accessible. You don't want to put them somewhere where a driver can't get to. You might want to put them up front so that it can communicate sort of a green image if that's something that you're interested in. It's well lit and protected from the environment, especially in New York State. We know how much snow and snow removal can affect infrastructure like that. So to help facilitate installations, you'll want to understand that every installation is unique. It's hard to put a hard and fast rule on how much a site or how much a station will cost to install, because a lot of those cost escalators are sort of the soft costs that depend on the site. So when you're looking at sites, you'll want to look at the location. So is it visible? Is it a preferred location? But then also you'll want to consider that location to where your electric source is, which brings you to that number 2, the wire run. So if you can site a charging station near your electric source, you can cut costs that way so that you don't have to run more conduit, run more wire, do more trenching if that's something that you'll have to do at the site. The electric supply is also important. If you don't have the electricity that you need for a charging station available, that can be another cost escalator where you might have to up your service with your local utility. And then that 4th one, the EVSE, and I should have covered this earlier, but EVSE, that's electric vehicle supply equipment, just an industry term for a charging station. But that's going to be what type of charging station. So there's wall mounted, there's the pedestal. Do you need a longer cord? Do you need certain networking? So does your station need to be able to communicate to a cloud service? Do you want to collect data on the station use? Things like that. Then you'll want to look into the local permitting. So what's the process, the cost, any local experiences. And then other is kind of a catch-all, but you know, protection, signs, maintenance, all of that might come into play. So this is a big one for when you're thinking about installing charging stations, and this will come back to a little bit also on how considering this cost can kind of come into play when you're considering how to maybe set requirements for a local zoning code. So including conduit in a parking lot can really help reduce costs. That bar chart is simply showing the cost difference between a site that was prepared for charging stations versus one that wasn't. So when we see the cost reduction, it's really about having that conduit put in place so that, and also making sure the electric panel has the capacity and available breaker slots. So if you can avoid trenching a parking lot to have to put down conduit and run the wire, you can really help save money. So we always recommend that, you know, if a new development is going in, even if charging stations aren't something you think are valuable at this moment, with growing registration, we always say just think about maybe including the conduit that could, you know, run the right size wire through it to a location that makes sense for a charging station, so that if you decide in the future to do that, you have that option. Charging stations can also be used as a bargaining tool. So if a municipality supports electric vehicle initiatives, this could be seen as a negotiating tool and use it to leverage for variances. Again, this is going to be a case-by-case basis, but we do like to highlight this, that, you know, charging stations often are supported through local, you know, sustainability initiatives, so it's just something to keep in mind. Another important kind of tool to help implement charging stations is keeping in mind that they are often supported by many sustainability rating systems, and in that way they can be valuable to developers. So we don't have to go into the details of each of these, but these are kind of the big 4 that come to mind when you think of sustainability recognition or rating systems, and they all do consider EV chargers or supporting electric vehicles as a means to help you know, get to those certifications. So some tools to facilitate electric vehicle adoption. In this section, we'll kind of go over how these blue boxes can help allow, incentivize, require, and regulate electric vehicles. So that'll be zoning, codes, permitting, parking, and then partnerships and procurement. So the first one we have is zoning. So zoning laws really are, as we note here, kind of the preliminary steps to ensure charging stations that, you know, they are supported and they're not restricted. So first, they can really help allow for and just kind of make it easier. We have seen in our work in deployment that if you know, a municipality hasn't considered charging stations, it can be it can really discourage people from actually installing them, even if it wasn't intended. If there's a lengthy permitting process, or you know, just too much red tape, a lot of people are turned off by it, which happens with lots of new technology. So defining electric vehicles and charging stations in your local planning and land use context is important, and including them in your zoning use tables. You can consider incentivizing charging stations. So, you know, as I mentioned before, incentivize charging station pre-wiring, or, you know, just having the conduit in place as a developer incentive. Or you could take it a step further and require it. So there are some examples, as we have noted here, in New York State, where they're starting to require that. So again, codes and permitting, really important tool to help encourage charging station deployment. It can really help increase adoption rates. So you'll want to consider setting some design standards and criteria for charging stations. It can seem like it might be, you know, you don't want to set too many rules, but having those in place can actually really help, so that any potential site host considering it can kind of help be guided through this process. We also recommend streamlining the permitting process, and if possible, reducing the costs, because again, it's a new technology, and you know, it's hard to get people to take the first jump, so making it easier can really help. And then also consider, again, requiring it. So requiring those conduits, any new developments, you might want to make sure that they're EV ready, or you can do it as a numerical or percentage based. We see that in New York City with Local Law 130. They've set a requirement for any new development to have a certain percentage dedicated to charging stations, excuse me, percentage of available parking. And I'll also just note here that New York State does have the new Make Ready program with all 6 investor-owned utilities, so that's something to look out for. I'm not sure if all of them have announced their program details, but there will be funding available for those first initial costs, so those installation costs I keep referencing. And parking, finally. So support drivers and non-drivers with these measures. So incentivizing, that can be just, you know, offering up the best parking spot. Might seem trivial, but it really is a benefit that people do like. And then the other part is making sure that you have clear signage. So we kind of have 2 picture examples there. One is of a charging station that has no signage, that doesn't communicate any sort of regulated parking laws. And you see 2 vehicles parked there that are not electric vehicles. Whereas at the bottom, you see there's clearly marked available for an electric vehicle to come and charge. Those parking signs are useful to the EV driver so that it is available to them, but it's also helpful to the non-EV driver. You know, they might not know that it's only for electric vehicles. But it also helps raise awareness, because then they know that these stations are around. You know, if it's a wayfinding sign, they know, oh, in that parking lot there is a charging station, and it suddenly becomes a, you know, something that is possible for them, something that they could consider, I should say. And then last for this section, partnerships and procurement. So looking for local partners to work with. So that can be working with private or quasi-public partners to install public access infrastructure. You can also look at utilizing discounts, incentives, and other programs with through those partnerships to help purchase, install, or promote either whether it's electric vehicles or the charging stations. You can also use these to regulate, so enforcing parking laws, you know, those EV-only spaces with the charging station hosts, and then potentially local law enforcement if applicable. And then lastly, partnering with the utilities. So lots of utilities are starting to have more and more programs. They can also help with installations and customer outreach. Employers are a big one. Lots of workplaces are starting to do sort of workplace charging programs that can be helpful in just getting awareness, but also, you know, you might be able to partner with a local employer and do a cool program with them. And then last is dealerships, which is clearly important. They can help with demonstrations, outreach, and then some will even set up a bulk purchasing program with other local employers. And then for our last section, how to, you know, other options to help encourage EV adoption and to keep in mind from a planning perspective. So the first is comprehensive plans. Not too much explanation necessary here, but comprehensive plans, if you have, you know, electric vehicle charging stations specified in them, great. If not, even just using general transportation sustainability goals can really help, you know, make the case for charging stations in local development. Participating in local initiatives is another great way to kind of, you know, get involved. It can help motivate people. It can help build off momentum in other places. We have listed here a couple example programs, but there are many more. You'll want to, you know, follow these to identify opportunities and leverage, you know, funding, or just like I said, that momentum. It can be really, really helpful. Leading by example. So demonstrate that electric vehicles and charging stations can really help encourage others. So, you know, it speaks for itself, but if a municipality has charging stations on their property, if they have electric vehicles in their fleet, it can, you know, show the community that this is a viable technology. And again, we'll mention that standardizing the signage. So if your municipality can set standard signage laws for all charging stations, that can really help electric vehicle drivers find the stations, but also again help the non-EV drivers, whether it's communicating a regulation or a requirement. And it can also help boost awareness that the, you know, the technology is around, and this is a you know, something that you can consider for your next vehicle option. And then for our last slide in this section is just keeping in mind, you know, there are also these special programs that can help, you know, encourage electric vehicles or electric vehicle charging. So aggregating purchasing campaigns that can help secure discounted prices on electric vehicles or charging stations. Workplace charging initiatives, sort of mentioned that before, but you can target employees and sort of communicate details on charging stations and the vehicles, and potentially, you know, get a new charging station for a big local employer. And then sustainable weekend tourism models. The one we have highlighted here is for Ulster County, getting New York City residents upstate, but this can go, you know, all of New York State is a kind of a tourism industry, so it's really applicable statewide, but encouraging zero tailpipe vehicles through tourism destinations can, you know, be another avenue for encouraging charging stations or electric vehicles. So with that, I'll say thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions now, but I'm happy to answer any.
See, I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but I think what's the two takeaways, I think, from your presentation, and thank you, by the way, for sharing the resource with us. Hopefully people take advantage of coming back and checking that out, is that it is necessary to, can you hit stop screen share?
Sure.
Be good. That way we can queue it up for our next person. Thank you, Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
I communities have to be prepared in some degree to be able to implement some standards and guidance to require or encourage charging stations for electric vehicles, because otherwise they may be just on a hope and a prayer that they start to come forward for development projects that come forward. In my home municipality, I know we have incorporated charging stations into some of the calculations for when a project comes forward with a certain number of parking spaces. So those are good steps to be able to implement. I think the signage and considerations for encouragement of EV adoption are critical steps also. So, but again, I want to remind folks to please use that chat function if you do have questions. It's a great way to communicate with our presenters here. In the second portion of our program, we have Andy Ike from Beam available. And one thing I think is super valuable from Beam's perspective is that there's a great degree of flexibility that Andy will talk about with this unique charging station adaptation that they have. Certainly as planners, we're used to the regulatory process, and there are all sorts of considerations that need to go on when we're talking about siting these facilities and the infrastructure that's necessary, the installation costs, and there can be some resistance from the development community as far as the permanence and the sunk cost of installing this infrastructure. So I think when we start to talk about implementing EV infrastructure, it's also important to consider that there are other and a wide variety of alternatives out there for either developers or municipalities that want to dip their toe in this water or be able to implement infrastructure where they've had some barriers to implementing it before. So with that, I'm really glad to have Andy and Beam aboard to be able to walk us through some of their emerging technology and be able to talk about how they've deployed it to reduce the barriers to adopting EV infrastructure in municipalities. Andy, it's all you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Martin. And thank you to the Capital District Regional Planning Commission for the opportunity to speak to you all here today about electric vehicle charging. And Victoria, thank you for a fantastic presentation from you and Energetics. A lot of things you talked about are some great points and things to consider in terms of, best practices when you're looking at installing charging infrastructure at a location, and some of the potential barriers that you may run into in the course of that. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today from our side of things, just some of those barriers you may be running into and the solutions that can help you overcome those barriers ultimately. So I'm going to go ahead and get my screen share pulled up here real quick. Okay, you see my screen share hopefully?
I see that you started. It's coming up. There we go. I can see your screen. You may want to move your Zoom controls again, and there you go. Excellent.
Beautiful. So our solution that we offer is called the EV ARC. EV ARC is actually, it's an acronym that's short for Electric Vehicle Autonomous Renewable Charger. I know that may sound like a mouthful, but I'm going to kind of explain a little bit more what that all entails after I just sort of walk you through our system. So this is what the EV ARC looks like. The EV ARC essentially combines solar plus battery storage to charge the electric vehicle charging station of our client's choice on our system. So when we're talking about our system specifically, what we're really talking about is just essentially just, helping you get the exact same charging stations that Victoria was talking about before up and going at your location without any sort of planning, permitting, design, or any kind of installation work like construction. We had talked about the digging and trenching or potentially upgrading circuitry or doing transformers. And so, with the system that we offer, it's fully solar powered, which basically means that all the system's power is generated from our solar array. Our solar array has a tracking technology that follows the sun throughout the day. In addition, all of our systems, they have onboard storage. So when you're not charging a vehicle, you're charging a battery. So then that way you have energy on hand for nighttime charging, cloudy or rainy days, or for even charging vehicles, even if there's a blackout or other sort of natural disaster of sorts. We'll talk a little bit more about that here later and why some of our clients appreciate that aspect of our system. You'll notice that there is an articulated curved column underneath this large white box, and then this column connects to this 1.25 inch thick solid steel base plate. So this solid steel base plate, this comes with the system. The entire system itself is specifically designed and engineered to fit within a standard 18 by 7.5 foot parking space. And a car can actually physically park on this base plate underneath the solar array. And that's important for our clients just because, one question we get a lot of when we put these in a parking lot is, well, are we losing a parking space as a result of this? And no, you are not. You're not losing a parking space. This base plate actually acts as a parking space as well, so you're not losing a parking space. The other thing to call out here with the base plate is that there's a significant portion of our system's overall total weight right here in this base plate. And so as a result of that, our system has actually been wind certified to withstand up to 120 mile per hour sustained winds. And it's able to sustain that even without needing to be bolted or affixed into the ground in any way, shape, or form. And that's a really important aspect of our system, that not being affixed or bolted into the ground, because from our experience, kind of going back to Victoria's presentation and talking about having to go through the whole planning, permitting, design sort of phase, with our system, since it is not bolted or affixed into the ground, and in addition, because our system is a fully off-grid or standalone piece of equipment that requires absolutely zero grid connection, our system has not required a permit in any jurisdiction we have ever deployed these systems in. And the reason for that has been every jurisdiction we have ever deployed these systems in has considered our system as either just a piece of equipment or as a temporary or as a non-permanent structure. From our experience, when you start bolting or affixing things into the ground, when you start connecting things to the grid, from our experience, that's generally when the local jurisdiction requires a permit. But again, that's one less thing you probably won't need to worry about with our system from that perspective of things, is not requiring a permit. And then the last bit to call out with this base plate is that it basically allows our system to be a permanent, but also a transportable piece of equipment. We'll talk a little bit more about one of our clients who really appreciated that here later on. So I won't spend too much time here on this slide because Victoria did a fantastic job of kind of overviewing some of the work that goes into installing a traditional grid-tied electric vehicle charging station. Obviously she talked a lot about the whole planning, permitting, design phase of the project. Depending on the local jurisdiction, that process can sometimes take a couple of weeks. From our experience, we've also talked with folks who it's taken them multiple months, some folks even more than a year just for the permitting side of things alone. Once you've gotten through that whole permitting process of things and, the local jurisdiction has then given you the A-OK to begin the construction work where you can actually stick a shovel into the ground. That's really where the project, involves work, that Victoria covered, work like digging and trenching or running conduit and wiring or upgrading circuitry or transformers from an electrical perspective of things. This whole construction aspect of the project is, as Victoria mentioned, it's something that really varies widely from location to location because of all these various different factors that are involved at these locations from an infrastructure perspective of things. Just to use a little bit of data that's been shared with us from some of our clients, one of our top clients is the state of California. We're based out in California. State of California, we work with 8 different state agencies here, and they have told us that their grid-tied charging installs are taking them up to 18 months for some of their locations. And then to use an example of another client of ours on the opposite side of the country, it's actually our largest client that we have today. It's the city of New York. We're going to talk about them here in a little bit also, but they're telling us that their installs are taking up to 24 months from start to finish. And then just to use some data for more of a cost perspective of things with New York, City of New York has actually told us that they've been quoted $2,000 per linear foot of digging and trenching for some of their locations. And it's not out of the question at all to have to run a 50-foot trench, a 100-foot trench, even a 200-foot trench for some locations. And, you do the math, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, just for one location alone. And, that's, oftentimes for most clients, that makes that a cost prohibitive project where that's never going to get off the ground from that perspective of things. So you have all the planning, the permitting, the design, all the installation work we just talked about here. After you've gone through all the installation work, you then are going to need to go to your local utility with a grid-tied charging station and get an interconnect agreement with them. Again, interconnect agreements, it really varies in terms of the amount of time it takes. Some of them can be fairly streamlined where it might take a week or two. We've also seen some where it takes months in some cases also too. And then once you have finally gotten the interconnect agreement all squared away with the utility, you're able to turn your charging station on. From that point in time, you're not out of the woods yet from a cost perspective of things, because at that point in time, after you've installed that grid-tied charging station, you've turned it on, It's then going to impact your electrical bill every single month there then after. And then the next question becomes, well, hey, how much is it going to impact my utility bill? And that's, frankly, it's a real wild card. It's a real hard number to project. And part of the reasoning for that is because, with many utilities, they often have, peak demand surcharges, rising electricity prices. A grid-tied charging station, over the course of its lifetime can generate anywhere from about $30,000 to $80,000 worth of electricity. And so, there's a really wide range there for that back-end cost of energy. And then the same thing, it goes also just for going back to kind of the installation phase side of things. One bit of feedback that's been shared with us from some of our other clients when they're installing grid-tied charging infrastructure is that oftentimes the local contractor will come to them and they'll say, all right, we're looking at about, $10,000, $15,000 worth of costs. The project is probably going to take us about 3 to 4 weeks worth of time. And then they begin the construction project. They start digging up the ground. Maybe they find something underneath the ground that they didn't know was there before. And then as a result of that, the cost of the project, sometimes can double, even triple. And then, the length of time that those projects can cost can, sometimes double or triple as well too. So there's just overall, there's a lot of uncertainty with both the actual installation side of things on the front end costs and the timing aspect, and then also on the back end cost of the energy, and then how much it's going to impact your utility bill after you install that grid tied charging infrastructure. So with our clients, they look at the fact that, hey, you can go through all of this work that we've just talked about right here up to this point in time, or alternatively, instead of going through that whole process that we've just talked about, they can instead just do this. So this is how we deliver all of our EV ARC units here in California. We actually have a customized hydraulic trailer called our patented ARC mobility trailer, which is what you can see right here. It arrives on site with the EV ARC fully assembled with the charging station of your choice pre-mounted onto it, and it is rapidly deployed again without any planning, permitting, or installation work whatsoever. What happens is that our driver just basically backs the trailer with the EV ARC unit up into the parking space, just like you are seeing right here. After he backs it up into the parking space, he simply gets out of the truck. He's utilizing some hydraulic rams that are on the trailer to lower it into the parking space, just like you're seeing right now. And then at that point in time, he activates the EV ARC, he activates the charging station, and then boom, at that point in time, you have a fully functional electric vehicle charging station ready to go and ready to charge vehicles without any of the work we just talked about before. So then, the next question we often get from folks is, well, what do we do now? And it's simple. You just go ahead and you plug in your car just like you would with any other regular charging station that you see out in the public eye. Our charging stations, they behave and they charge exactly like the grid-tied charging stations, just without any installation or impact on the utility bill. One of the other really exciting aspects with an EV ARC is, with an EV ARC, it's 100% solar powered, it's 100% renewably energized. So at that point, your electric vehicle is driving 100% emissions free on nothing but clean, renewable sunshine. That's often something that helps a lot of our clients in government, especially with reaching certain carbon emission reduction goals, climate action plan goals, general green fleet or sustainability goals and whatnot. So hopefully that video just kind of showcases again just how fast and how easy you can get a charging station up and going at your location. This next slide here is going to talk a little bit more about our work with the City of New York. We have worked with the City of New York ever since 2015, and City of New York is actually our largest client that we have to date. They have about 90 of our EV ARC units deployed throughout all the 5 boroughs. And I always sort of chuckle a little bit about that, because whenever we're talking with people first about, our work and the types of clients that we work with and the geographical location of them, the first bit of feedback we always get from clients, potential clients is, well, your biggest client has got to be somebody in California, or it's got to be somebody in Florida or somewhere in Arizona, or somebody that gets really good sunlight. But no, it's actually City of New York, who, we all know. I'm actually originally from New York myself. City of New York gets some cold, dark, gray, snowy and dreary New York City winters. And so part of the reason why they were actually so interested in our solution in the first place was because of the infrastructure challenges that I touched upon before. Some of their installs were taking them up to 24 months from start to finish. They recorded $2,000 per linear foot of digging and trenching. And so just they had so many significant infrastructure challenges, as many, older cities do, where they just have old infrastructure. They have more challenges they run into from that perspective of things. Another large reason as to why the city of New York was initially interested in our solution was, as some of you may be aware, the city of New York is actually undergoing a major initiative where they are in the process of transitioning their entire city fleet of vehicles over to all electric vehicles. And so, over the course of this transition over to electric vehicles within their city fleet, one of the big questions that has come up with them, as well as with many other, government fleets across the country, has been, what happens if we have a major blackout or power outage or natural disaster that knocks out power for days? Within City of New York's mind, they very much had Hurricane Sandy in the forefront of their mind, which, as many of you may recall, that knocked out power for a couple of days back, I think in the 2014 timeframe. And so, one of their big questions that they had was, well, if we have another Hurricane Sandy or another major grid outage, how do we keep our fleet vehicles running and still providing vital services to our constituents, even in an emergency type of scenario? So many people in government are hedging for these types of events by having a certain percentage of their electric vehicle charging be off grid and to be resilient from that perspective of things. So that is, a really key feature to call out with our system, is that, unlike a traditional grid tied charging station, we can still charge an electric vehicle and keep it running even if there's a loss of power or a grid outage from that perspective of things. And then also just, in addition, we talked about sort of the green fleet goals and the whole 100% emissions free driving. That was obviously something that very much played into the city of New York's decision to go with a fully solar powered solution like the one that we offer here. So another big reason as to why the city of New York went with our solution was sort of the off-grid power aspect of our system. In addition to being able to still charge electric vehicles even if the grid is down, our system can also be outfitted to double as just a general off-grid power asset for other sort of resiliency needs. This is another aspect that's really important for our municipal clients who have resiliency goals from that perspective of things. And so one very interesting development that we saw took place earlier this year, back in March and April, when the country was grappling with COVID-19 and all of the major impact that it was having across the country. And many of our municipal clients were looking at ways that they would be going to be able to help their local populations, from that perspective of things. And so a lot of our local municipal clients were actually setting up COVID-19 response sites at various different locations where they had off-grid power needs. And so clients of ours, like City of New York, and other clients of ours, were coming to us and asking about the possibility of potentially relocating their EV ARC units, which were not being as heavily utilized from an electric vehicle charging perspective, to these COVID-19 response sites for off-grid power needs. And so it just kind of highlights sort of, this other sort of interesting use case that's been really important and really valuable to our local municipal clients. The city of Oakland actually, City of Oakland, California, actually ended up relocating a few of their EV ARC units to a COVID-19 response site, again, when these EV ARC units were not being used as much from an EV charging perspective. So I'm going to show you guys this video that just kind of just highlights that was picked up by some local news coverage.
Happening today on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, the city of Oakland has moved one of its electric vehicle charging stations to provide EV charging and emergency power to a coronavirus testing facility. The chargers, made by Envision Solar, will provide power to the site without having to use a generator. Oakland usually has the units in locations where they could provide emergency power in case of grid failures. This is the first time that the EV chargers are being used to support COVID-19 related medical needs.
COVID is a respiratory problem, so having generator fumes and that sort of stuff in a test center is hardly ideal. This is a great way for Oakland to have a clean and renewable source of electricity, which is silent and emissions free.
Envision Solar says it is working with other cities and corporate partners to do the same thing across the world, in fact.
New this morning, observing Earth Day, which is today as the country battles the coronavirus pandemic. A short time ago here, the city of Oakland relocated a solar-powered electric vehicle and disaster energy charging system. It was moved to a COVID-19 test site to energize electric cars and provide backup power for the facility. Oakland leaders say it's an example of the city's commitment to sustainability by using equipment for a number of purposes.
This is a self-contained electric vehicle charging station totally powered by solar. So it's green, sustainable, but most importantly, it's portable. And that's why we have it here at the test station today.
These portable units fit inside a single parking spot. The technology allows the guidance system to follow the sun throughout the day, and the energy is stored in onboard batteries and then can be used at any time.
Okay, well, hopefully that video just, apologies for the audio latency there from that perspective. Thanks for letting me know about that, Martin. But again, hopefully that just showcased again just some of the, the sort of the other aspects of how our other clients are utilizing the system, not just from an electric vehicle charging perspective of things, but also from kind of a resiliency aspect. I want to talk also a little bit about one of our private enterprise clients who we have worked with in New York State, which is Pfizer, who has a location in Pearl River, New York, in the Hudson Valley region. And one of the interesting sort of facets as to why Pfizer had approached us in the first place about potentially acquiring EV ARC units was the fact that Pfizer, like many other large companies and Fortune 500 companies, they have these very large open surface parking lots. And in these very large open surface parking lots, there's oftentimes not a lot of infrastructure or a lot of available infrastructure. Some of the locations where they did have the power or the infrastructure was not the most practical place to put that charging station where that was going to get the most use. Victoria had talked a little bit about that in her presentation prior in terms of, trying to pick out a location where, you have enough circuit capacity. That's also the most practical place to put the charging station where it's going to get the most use. But unfortunately, from our experience, those two things don't always line up. From our experience, we have a lot of our clients who, when they're first going and looking at installing grid-tied charging infrastructure, oftentimes they are only looking at the cheapest and easiest place to install a charging station, but they're not always necessarily factoring in, is that location also the most practical place to put the charging station and where it's going to get the most use? So oftentimes from our experience in those instances where they're just picking out a cheap, easy place to install it, but not a practical place where the charging station is going to get the most use, oftentimes, you're picking out a location where maybe you're like, you're close to the power source, but you're out of the way. Oftentimes, these are locations where you're behind a building or on the side of the building. As Victoria mentioned, if you don't have good wayfinding to these locations, oftentimes, these charging stations will be underutilized or, not utilized enough. And that's not why our clients are putting these charging stations in. They want to put them in so they're getting used. And so oftentimes from our clients' experience, where they go install those charging stations at a cheap, easy place to install it, but then the charging station doesn't get used because of the location picked out. From our experience, once they realize that they've picked out a easy place to install, but it wasn't the best place where it's going to get the most use, they then realize, oh boy, we made a mistake. We have to go move that charging station and go put it somewhere else, where it's going to get used more. And then from that perspective, you got to go through that whole installation process we talked about again, the planning, the permitting, the design, the construction, the managing the subcontractors, the interconnect to the utility. But here's the thing to keep in mind with an EV ARC unit. These systems are transportable. So ultimately with an EV ARC unit, the thing to keep in mind is that there are no mistakes. You can go ahead and you can put an EV ARC unit down somewhere. If you have another location which just has a higher demand, no problem. You can pick the EV ARC unit up and you can move it to that other location. Another facet as to why Pfizer wanted to go with a solution like this is that at this location that they were on, they were actually on a leased property, and there was some uncertainty as to what was going to happen when that lease expired, and so it set up sort of a potentially awkward conversation with their landlord in terms of that landlord may or may not be inclined to install traditional grid-tied charging at that location, depending on where they are or where they aren't in that lease. But then with an EV ARC, the thing to keep in mind is that if you're on a leased property, you can go ahead and you can put it down and leave it there. If you end up staying there, great, no problem. You've got your EV charging already figured out. If you end up moving somewhere else, you can go ahead and you can pick it up and you can move it with you to your next location. And so just having a transportable charging solution just gives you this incredible amount of flexibility and scalability with your infrastructure that you just don't get with permanently installed grid-tied charging. Kind of going back to the whole scalability aspect, a lot of times we have clients of ours who, when they're going and installing grid-tied charging, oftentimes, they're working with consultants and they're trying to determine, the perfect amount of charging stations based on the circuit capacity and, how many people at that location might have electric vehicles or how many electric vehicles they have there within their fleet. But it's very, very difficult to project that right at the very beginning in that sort of initial planning phase. But with an EV ARC, it's just very scalable. So you go ahead and you put your EV ARC unit down there. If you're seeing your system so heavily utilized, hey, it's no problem. You want to add more EV charging, you just buy another EV ARC, and then within about 30 to 90 days, that next unit arrives on site and is able to be deployed rapidly without any of that sort of construction or installation work. So The last bit just to call out with the EV ARC as to why this was selected by Pfizer was just, they love the aspect of having, this fully solar powered charging solution right front and center in front of their location. They just thought it was something that really spoke to their commitment to sustainability and clean transportation for their employees, renewable energy. And so, we have a lot of our clients who love all the practical benefits that we've already talked about here today, but they just also love the whole highly visible sustainability aspect of our system as well too. So. And now, just to quickly talk a little bit about some funding resources. On our side of things, just for a little bit of info, most of our clientele that we work with is in the government sphere of things. We work with government agencies at the federal, state, and local levels, mostly at the local levels, though I will say. And we do understand that COVID-19 has had a significant financial impact on our local municipal clients that has made infrastructure projects like EV charging a difficult proposition to go add charging based on that decrease in budget. But one thing to keep in mind is that, from our side of things, we've actually brought on board a DC-based funding consultant, and we've identified numerous federal funding opportunities that our system is eligible for. As Victoria had mentioned, there's a lot of funding opportunities out there for electric vehicle charging and electric vehicle charging stations specifically. But in addition to that, because our system combines renewable energy, it adds in the whole resiliency aspect, it adds in the sustainability aspect of things. Because it involves these things, there's other federal funding resources that this system is applicable for. Many of these federal funding resources actually cover the full 100% cost of our system. And so we're offering consultations with our consultant, absolutely free of charge, to look at potential funding sources, kind of taking into account the significant impact that COVID-19 has had on many folks' budgets across the board. So just another aspect to keep in mind with a system like this. And then just a quick bit about us here at Beam. We are a San Diego-based sustainable technology innovation company. We were originally founded in 2006 as Envision Solar. We actually rebranded to Beam just about a month and a half ago. And we're a publicly traded company. All of our information is readily available online, if that's ever something that's of interest to anyone. And then I mentioned we're in San Diego. We actually do all of our manufacturing of our equipment right here on site in San Diego, California. I'm not sure how much everyone out there knows about San Diego, but San Diego is a big military town. It's a big part of the fabric and framework of who San Diego is as a city and who San Diego is as a region. And we very much proudly mirror that here at Beam. A large portion of our staff are veterans, many of them even combat veterans. These are the folks who are building this equipment down on our assembly floor. So not only do we utilize all the highest quality components when we're building EV ARC units, but they're also built by America's finest. That's something we're extremely proud of and something we like to put out there so that people know who they're getting into business with.
Certainly appreciate that bit of information one day after Veterans Day. So thank you for sharing that with us. And
certainly. And thank you to
your
our
commitment to that.
Certainly, no, and thank you to any veterans who are on the line here, obviously, and for their sacrifice that they've made over the years. A day late, but never better late than never, right?
Certainly. We did have a couple questions from folks that are viewing the webinar. As far as how is snow management handled with these types of units?
Sure. So with regards to snow, there's just a couple of sort of unique aspects that you want to keep in mind with snow. The one thing we always recommend is to not let more than 6 inches of snow accumulate on the solar array. It's just, it affects your production on the system. We also say that, if you have EV ARC units in a parking lot that gets snow plowed, you're just going to want to let your snow plowers know about where the EV ARC unit is placed and to make sure that they are aware to plow around the EV ARC unit. We also do recommend for clients to maybe put a couple of cones out around the corners and the edges of it the night before. If snow is coming overnight, or if it's coming later in the day, just always helps to put a couple of cones around just from a visibility perspective of things. And so, yeah, from a snow perspective, those are the main things you're going to want to keep in mind. So
we saw some of the rule of thumb costs as far as permanent installations. Are there kind of rule of thumb costs for these types of units?
In what essence are you referencing, Martin?
Just a generality of what per unit they may cost.
Oh, sure. So on average, a single EV ARC unit will cost anywhere from about $60,000 to $75,000 on average. Now, all of the systems are fully customizable with regards to, what kind of charging station we're utilizing. Again, keep in mind, we're charger agnostic. We incorporate the charging station of our client's choice on the station, and it comes pre-mounted, ready to go. We can also customize the amount of storage that's on board, so we can upgrade storage for people who are doing fleet charging, where most of the charging is going to be happening overnight. overnight. And then there's other optional ancillary features like the emergency power panel feature that allows it to act as a resiliency asset, but about $60,000 to $75,000 on average. And I do want to just speak to that cost here as it relates to our system. Our system will often win out from a total cost of ownership perspective compared to a grid-tied charging station. When you look at all the avoided costs related to absolutely zero installation work, and then absolutely zero impact on your utility bill, zero fueling costs if you're looking at this from a fleet perspective of things. And when you also look at the added value of, the transportable aspect, the resiliency aspect, and the emissions-free driving aspect, it's really that all-in intrinsic value as to why we're being selected by folks like City of New York and State of California, Google, folks like that. So,
what level of charge do these units support? Are they categorized as kind of a level 2? Is that how they're stacked up?
So with EV ARC units, we can incorporate any level of charging. So with a single EV ARC unit, like you've been seeing here in all these slides here in this presentation, we can accommodate either level 1 or level 2 charging capabilities. We can accommodate DC fast charging as well. We're just actually beginning to roll out our EV ARC DC fast charging lineup here as we move into 2021. And the way that we make fast charging work with EV ARC units is that we take multiple EV ARC units and we interconnect them together in a row of parking spaces. And then those multiple EV ARC units essentially are connected to a DC fast charging station that is then in turn powering from that perspective.
Okay.
So,
then we had one more question. Are there larger units that can accommodate medium or heavy duty vehicles?
Excellent question. And yes, there absolutely is. So we also offer a separate product line called our Solar Tree product line. The Solar Tree is essentially just a larger EV ARC. It uses all the same design aspects, technology, just on a much larger power scale and on a more permanently installed basis. So we're actually in the process of doing a full redesign of our Solar Tree product line so that it is specifically geared towards charging medium and heavy duty electric vehicles like electric vans, electric buses. We know this is the direction the electric vehicle market is going, especially from a fleet perspective of things. And so we expect that product line to be available at some point in 2021. So,
and then one final question, and I'll kind of wrap things up. How big is the battery? How much of a charge does it hold? I know it's relative to weather, the level of charge in the vehicle, but are there some kind of back of the napkin details about the battery storage capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of our EV ARC units, they come standard equipped with 24 kilowatt hours of onboard battery storage. But we can upgrade that storage as needed. So we can go to what we would consider our medium level of storage, which is 32 kilowatt hours, or our maximum level, which is 43 kilowatt hours of onboard storage. So
okay, it's excellent stuff. So really, what I wanted to try to drive home for our planning and zoning board members is there are a lot of options and a lot of methods you can use, not only to plan and advance your community to adopting EV infrastructure, but there's almost, because of the range and flexibility and the type of charging stations, and certainly with the opportunities that Beam was discussing about the mobility and flexibility of their charging stations, that there's almost no reason to say no when you're engaged with folks who are interested in implementing EV technology on a regional scale or on a community scale, because there are so many emerging technologies and flexibility for them. And that's the point I kind of wanted to drive home when we talk about the landscape for EVs, and then the potential to be able to install the infrastructure, be it on-grid or off-grid, for that to take shape in your community. So with that, I really want to thank Victoria and I want to thank Andy for their time and commitment this afternoon to share with us their expertise. There's a lot of emerging technologies, so if folks can reach out to them, I'll put their contact information with the materials that'll be emailed out after the presentation. And I would certainly thank everybody for taking time today and attending this webinar. We will be back next week with a session about New York State OPRHP's CRIS system. That is an online one-stop shop for doing your archaeological review for development projects. So with that, thank you, Andy. Thank you I have to cheat, I have to check your name, I'm so sorry, to Victoria. And I really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you very, very much.
No problem.
thank you for the opportunity,
Bye-bye.
Martin, and thank you, everyone.
Yes, take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.